My name is Katie Smith, and I am with the IARPIC Early Career Community of Practice. There are 4 of us currently serving, and another one of our group is on the call right now, Angela Bliss. If you ever want to reach out, you can go on the IARPIC page and find us. We also are joined by board members of the U.S. chapter of APECS, the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. So I just want to keep moving so we can get to the main event. So for our webinar structure, we're going to have panelists introduce themselves. Then we're going to go into a moderated Q&A with our panelists, and then we're going to have an open discussion as a group. Really want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. Really want to thank you all for joining us. We really want to provide a space for people to ask questions, especially doing Arctic field campaigns, and want to make people feel more comfortable and confident going into the field. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Andy Mullen to start our intros.
Hi there, sure. It's great to meet everyone. So I'm Andy. I was a research engineer at Cornell University. Prior to that, I did my PhD at Scripps Oceanography. I actually didn't do any polar work during my PhD, did underwater work, but then that kind of transitioned into the polar career. So definitely, my thought process is like gain a skill and then apply it. You can apply it in all different types of environments, whether that's an engineering skill or a scientific skill. But yeah, so I did my PhD at Scripps, and then joined Brittany Schmidt's group, which developed the ice fin robot that you can see here. And so we did I did 3 seasons in Antarctica with that team. We also did some work up in the Arctic doing some geophysical surveys on pingos. Yeah, so that's kind of a little bit of my experience background. And so I'm now no longer part of or I'm still collaborating with the group at Cornell, but I'm no longer full-time with them. But yeah, I think we could go to the next slide. And so I'll just kind of put this seed in for thinking about the polar field work that I've been involved in. I really like this quote: "Plans are useless, but planning is indispensable." So my experience with polar fieldwork has been this interesting combination of having to do lots of logistic plans and then being really important and thinking about all the process we're doing, standard operating procedures, safety, but then having to adapt in the field when those plans don't work out perfectly. And so here's an example of my friend Dan. This Coke can was actually we had to get an instrument to work, and we needed something to hold like an epoxy resin, so we ended up using this Coke can. So I thought that was a fun example of figuring out augmenting the plans in the field, but also going through all of our logistics and plans beforehand. Yeah.
Thank you so much. All right. And great picture.
Oh yeah, I'm just also going to say, make sure I enjoy your time in the field as well. So these are just a few cool pictures of, we have Scott's, or one of the early explorer huts in Antarctica, and a few fun pictures from Antarctica.
Very cool. All right, Rachel, you're up.
Hello, everyone. So my name's Rachel, and I got my start in art and like focus on photography. So I came into a whole different way. But I come from Australia, ended up in McMurdo Station, and got really obsessed with attending every science lecture that was available. And then ended up spending 12 years out of McMurdo Station, going out into the deep field, supporting all sorts of logistics from penguin sites research to flat white to drilling camps, you name it. And then I moved from the Antarctic to the Arctic and spent time at Summit Station supporting logistics up there, and managed the station up there for a couple of years, and then was still obsessed with science. And then now I'm a project manager for Polar Field Services, mostly managing science in the Arctic now, and that's out of Greenland and also Alaska. And but I just like to throw out there, I did not like cold. I'm from Australia, and definitely had to learn to like the cold. And so you can go to the next slide. And from my field experience, I thought I would just share, I've spent many times, I think more time in tents in a 7-year period than in a roofed shelter. But I learned very quickly that if you're in a field camp and it's a small field camp and you don't pull your share, then people notice. So just remember that if there are different things that you can support people at your site, you should definitely look at ways you can do that and not just get tunnel vision on what you're doing science-wise, but also look at the bigger picture. And because everything is connected and everyone always, helps everyone accomplish whatever your task is. And if you're a team player, it goes a long way. So you can go to the next slide. Oh, thank you. So a positive experience, I just always found that if you can have a mentor, if it's your first time going into the field, you shouldn't be expected to know everything. So ask questions, embrace other people's experience, stand up and say if you don't know something, and take something to contribute to wherever it is you're going. Like little things go a long way. So definitely take that little board game or take time to find out what other people are doing to support your field camp, and you need water. But I'm looking forward to answering any questions anyone has and being here. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Aurora, you're up next.
Hey everybody, it's great to see you all and thanks for being here. This is one of my favorite things to talk about is like good field practice and working with communities in the Arctic. So I'm currently a PhD student at Scripps down in San Diego, but I live sort of mostly in Anchorage on Dena'ina Elena lands, and I'm from Fairbanks and Anchorage in Alaska. And so I always start with that because I feel like accountable to the communities of Anchorage and Fairbanks, and I feel accountable to sort of the place of Alaska, and it's the reason that I'm a scientist and why I do what I do. I have worked in Antarctica and the Arctic for kind of more than 10 years in different forms. So I think kind of relevant for this discussion, worked for a long time as a field engineer supporting a lot of different projects in Antarctica and Greenland. And feel like I was exposed to a lot of different ways that field work can happen through that. And then I also wanted to mention Inspiring Girls Expeditions. I've been an instructor for that program for several years, and that's sort of a different way of thinking about fieldwork. And I really feel like what I learned by being an instructor in that environment has shaped how I approach my own field science practice and want to make field science look more like what we do in Inspiring Girls Expeditions. And so I can talk more about that. And so my PhD, I guess I didn't say this, my PhD is I work in Greenland and I look at ice-ocean interactions and fjord ecosystems. And then I also think a lot about how we move towards anti-colonial science. I by no means am doing that perfectly, but I really enjoy talking about that and trying to think about how we can live out our values as scientists and support sovereignty of Arctic communities. So yeah, something. You can go to next slide. Yeah, I just wanted to share, I think I had maybe the most positive experience in our last field season. And I kind of fully trace that back to the fact that this was the first time that I was with a team where we created a code of conduct together before going into the field. And we also did a bystander intervention training. And it was more just that those two activities that we did together as a team, it was virtually on Zoom really opened up discussions in a way that I've actually never had before on field teams. And I think that like you can trace that directly to like why this experience was like my most favorite field work ever. And I would also echo the importance of good mentors. I feel like I had an amazing mentor, my advisor, Fiamma Straneo, who really empowered me to like bring the idea of code of conduct and bystander intervention training to our group. And that's why it was a fabulous time. And then I was thinking about challenges. And I think one of the theme of challenges that I've experienced is when you're an early career researcher, you're not always the person like making a lot of the decisions that happen like before going into the field. So a lot of times those decisions about logistics are made without you, and then maybe you're dropped into the field season. And that's where I think I've experienced a lot of tension, is that you're kind of like all of a sudden in the situation where you didn't necessarily have empowerment in some of those decisions. And so, yeah, I think I've been reflecting on that, like those experiences. And, when we say sort of every person on a field team is a leader, to really like own that, but that also that is tricky when you're an early career person or you're maybe the first time in the field. And so I'm happy to, talk about more, like, I think there's a deeper discussion there about like, well, what conditions can a field team create so that everybody feels safe to be a leader and feels like they can't speak up. So yeah, and I think that's it for me. So.
Great, thank you so much. All right.
Hi, my name is Elena Savidge, and I am a PhD student at the Colorado School of Mines. Oh, I think the slides are out of order. Maybe if you can go to the next one. Sorry about that. Okay, there you go. Yeah, currently finishing my PhD in the next couple of weeks, so I'm really excited to wrap that up and take a break and then think about what's next. But I really love what I do. I look at ice ocean processes in Antarctica, and then I have a background in Earth and Ocean Science from the University of Victoria in BC, Canada. Okay, so now you can go to the previous one, please. Sorry about that.
No problem. Here, let's is that this one?
Yeah, yes. Okay. So how did I end up here? There's so much that goes into how I ended up here. Obviously, the people you meet along the way, the experiences you get. But really, since I was a kid growing up in Canada, and I just had the opportunity to live in a few different places because my family has traveled, and that just really opened my eyes to how different things can be depending on where you are in the world. But really, I think what drew me to a career in earth science, and more specifically polar science, is just like this deep fascination that I have for the Earth system, both in study and in exploration. Yeah, basically, I just love this planet and I want to study it. So you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And then how I narrowed in on polar science, I think, so I started my undergraduate research looking at earthquake deformation from space. And then the tie to my research now is also looking at things from space. But what really blew my mind as an undergrad was, the fact that we can use these sensors that are 700 kilometers up in orbit to monitor like millimetric scale deformation. Like even saying that today, it just blows my mind how cool this science that we're doing is. So now I'm looking more at ice ocean processes because I wanted to do something that was a little bit more tied to climate. So yeah, next slide, please. And then finally, this past summer, I had the opportunity to go up in the Canadian High Arctic to help out in some field work, which really was a mind-opening experience. And by far, the most positive thing was the people, the people you work with, the local communities up there, the discussions we had. There's just so much knowledge, so much wisdom, and it's just such a different life. So just those discussions and those chats were really, really, really interesting. And then challenges, by far for me was the remoteness. Like I knew I was going very far, but I don't know if you can prepare for being so far from extensive medical attention if things go wrong, or, search and rescue and things like that. Just not really, I think, knowing fully the risks and the remoteness. So yeah, but overall, yeah, just a really honestly life-changing experience. So I'm excited to think more about doing Arctic research and Arctic fieldwork. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. And now Maddie.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I'm Madison Smith. I'm currently a scientist at the Hole Oceanographic Institution, but I've just started here about 1.5 years ago. But I actually got my start in kind of marine science working as a summer student here almost exactly 10 years ago in that photo in the upper left, where I was really interested in coastal work. I guess like a lot of people, and polar work kind of came at it from a different end of geophysics. So I was, yeah, zooming around on a jet ski in the coastal inlet. But yeah, I spent my first field season in the Arctic in 2014, which that middle season fell in love with working in polar regions, and have, yeah, worked in mostly the Arctic, but also the Antarctic since then. And yeah, so I've done a lot of field work, mostly on icebreakers, kind of mid-sized to large. And yeah, I think you can press next to get the photos on the bottom too. And then, oh, sorry, weird animation. Yeah, so I do, I've been involved in a lot of field campaigns, mostly in the Arctic, but also on one icebreaker in the Antarctic. And then this has included some international field work. I was a part of Mosaic in 2020, which was interesting to work with a really international group of colleagues, which has been really different than a lot of my US-based field work. And so comes with some of its own rewarding aspects, but also some of its own challenges in terms of leadership in the field and that sort of some of those structures of making it you know, effective and positive for everyone. Next slide. Yeah, so I think a lot about sea ice, which you can tell. I guess I didn't say that specifically, but I, yeah, really mostly work on sea ice and upper ocean physics. But I think, yeah, a lot of these things are universal to the disciplines, but also types of environments that you're working on. I think, like a lot of people have hinted at, a lot of my perspectives on what makes fieldwork really positive and rewarding has come from not always having positive experiences and having some challenges in the field that have built up my perspective on what are really important things going into a field season and building a team. And I think, yeah, with like most jobs, it's, you know, it's important to be professional, I think, but finding how that line between being professional, but also being in a space where you feel comfortable to be your own whole self and that everyone can ask for what they need is the challenge, but also what makes it really great. So I put on some photos of having fun during fieldwork too. It's not all, you know, it doesn't have to all be serious. Focusing on getting your work done in these really interdisciplinary teams is super awesome, but then finding time to like appreciate this unique experience and place that we get to be. Yeah, and so I think, you know, especially looking at some of these experiences, which have been really with really interdisciplinary teams, I think setting up these mechanisms for reporting that, and yeah, and also like mentorship across the really diverse groups of people that can be there. I think someone else mentioned too, like identifying a mentor for yourself, I think is important for everyone across career stages, like having someone that you know from the beginning that you can talk to things that come up. Just like, yeah, I guess having a friend and a support network is one of the biggest things that I wanted to bring up as something that I feel can be really useful. And yeah, you go into this sometimes not knowing, you know, anyone on the team, or at least not very many people. But yeah, identifying someone that you can kind of lean on is super helpful. So I'm there. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. So I think we'll move to a moderated Q&A with the panelists. Peter's going to help, and then we'll open it up to a larger discussion with the group. So feel free to turn your video on if you want, whatever makes you feel comfortable. And go ahead, Peter.
At this time, I'm going to ask a set of questions, and the panelists can just answer as they feel inspired to, and then there's only like 6 questions or so, and then we'll just see how that goes, and then if there's still time, we'll do sort of a free-form Q&A. So the first question is, what is the biggest thing you wish you knew going into the field for the first time?
I can go if you like. I know for me, I mentioned it, that coming from Australia, a hot place, how to stay warm when you're sleeping on the sea ice. Is it or if you're going somewhere by a coastal, so then it's a different type of cold, but that cold isn't just a flat out word. It means totally different things, whether it's wet and dry or dry and wet, whatever it is. And then, but I know other people have mentioned mentors, but finding out those things. Do you take a hot water bottle with you? Do you just take a Nalgene and put hot water in it? Do you need different layers of different types of gloves for where you're going if your hands get cold? And I've also learned that some people don't get cold. And so if your mentor is like, I don't ever get cold, like maybe pick 2 mentors. But yeah, seeking those little tips out goes a long way, and it's something you have to learn as well. You can't, it doesn't just happen. The more field experience you have, the better you get at it. But staying warm was definitely a huge thing for me.
I love that the person who managed Summit Station starts by saying she gets cold. So I think that brings the humanity to it all.
I can add a little bit on that. I think knowing what you're going to be prepared for, but then also practicing it is really helpful. Like all your gear, like put it on, make sure it works. Like if you have some type of instrument, see if you can operate it with your gloves. Try to like simulate the environment as close as possible while you're at home, because you'll realize all of a sudden, like, oh, if I just ordered this thing off Amazon, it'll be here in 2 days. It's going to make my job a lot easier. And you can do that while you're at home, but not in the field. So practice it in as close as simulation as you can. And then I think having really clear discussions with your team about your roles and responsibilities. Now, as someone early, you might not be a leader on a lot of things, but you might be a specific instrument. You're leading that on that instrument. And there might be areas where you're following along with and helping, assisting some other thing. And there might be times where it's actually most efficient just to step back and watch and learn, but not necessarily get in hands-on something. So having a clear description of your roles and responsibilities with your team, I think can be really helpful, having that discussion ahead of time.
Yeah, I can go next. The 2 things that came to mind for me, one is that like rest is not only okay, but necessary. And I think particularly going into the field for the first time, I was just so grateful and like wanted to like show up and work really hard. That's like the baseline that's necessary, that everyone contributes and works hard. But also you need to rest, and you're still a human in a body. I think, there can be a lot of adrenaline, there can be a lot of excitement, and we all do work really hard. And so if you're not in a leadership position where you are able to build and rest or identify those times when your team can rest, then I think it's really important to feel like you can speak up for yourself and know what you need and express that. And then the other thing I was going to say is that feelings matter, and talking about feelings is like an integral part of the fieldwork experience. And I think the first time that I went in, that wasn't like a part of the fieldwork culture that I was a part of. And I think this kind of connects to what Maddie said too about bringing your whole self, that like you need to have discussions about how things are working, what's going wrong, what's going well, how everybody is feeling, how everybody's doing, and that's like necessary for fieldwork to work well.
Yeah, I agree with everything that everyone said. And I think like for me, I think what would have been really helpful, because I've only been up there once. But I think to have more conversations about the remoteness and the risks and the potential dangers, because obviously you're going somewhere remote. If you're working on a glacier, like it's a dangerous environment, you need to have proper equipment. So just more conversations about that. And I think, reflecting back on my time now, there are just little things that I don't think I was fully aware of, and kind of probably relied a little bit too much on people who had experience. And, that's something that I should have done, like reach out more and ask people how it is. But I think more conversations before you actually get to the field. And like that way it's just easier to initiate conversation and not feel like, oh, I should know this, blah, blah, blah. But just, yeah, have those conversations before you actually go.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess one thing I would kind of add to that is, I think a lot of fieldwork and kind of the funding agencies are becoming a lot more common to have these kinds of code of conduct and these conversations before going into the field about like you know, whether the different mechanisms for support or different, you know, or even formal reporting. But I think there are definitely still situations where that isn't the case, and like there may be varying degrees to which that's true. And I just wish that I had known that that might be something that I would want, and that you can identify that for yourself, even if it's not part of the formal fieldwork that is there, or asking the team for that. So I guess just kind of like knowing the different range of things that can be available, and like knowing what you want to ask for if something's not identified. That is really important. Yeah.
Great. So I think we should move on to our next question, which is, I think, a very practical one. I don't know if you get more practical than this. Let's talk about gear. So, do you have any advice about gear for people going into the field? How to acquire it? What sort of safety measures do you need to take into consideration? Things like that.
I'll give one piece of advice. I found sometimes the list that the Antarctic or Arctic programs gives you can be really informal or can be really useful, but sometimes I like look at mountaineering websites and I look at what gear for really cold environments like mountain they spec for people, because they have like really detailed information and good links to like specific pieces of clothing you can get. So one little tip is like just search mountaineering expeditions to like Alaska or other places and see like what the gear they list is. And I use that as kind of a first order thing in addition to the polar ones.
And I can follow up with Andrew. Right now, this is my world, and I'm helping first-time researchers go into the field and working with PIs on what their gear list is and requirements. And what I've noticed is there is a broad spectrum. Some PIs are like, you need to have Gore-Tex and it needs to be the highest quality Gore-Tex. And then other PIs are like, you don't have to have the most expensive jacket. It just needs to have these specifications. So there's a lot of mixed messages out there. But I also like what Andrew just mentioned, doing your own research. If you get a gear list from your team leader, doing some more research about that area where you're going, and there's websites out there, and I'm happy to share these that like Steep and Cheap. There's different sites that you don't have to get the most expensive Patagonia jacket, and there's also secondhand places that have quality jackets too. So it doesn't have to be a $600 jacket to do the job. And just also getting a mentor too. That's like the most important thing too, is talking to someone who's been there and done it, and what worked for them is also huge.
The used gear, I only buy used stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can pop into don't pay for your own gear if you're getting gear to do work. I think that was something I didn't realize for a long time. And there are options. Either like if your PI is funded, hopefully there's enough money for them to be able to support your gear needs. And if there isn't, there's also sort of grants like PSECO that you can get as well. And you can also ask around. Lots of labs and PIs are willing to share. We've like lend out our gear all the time to other groups. So like never think that like your first option should not be you taking on the financial burden of getting gear.
I'll just follow up with the gear thing. I think a lot of the impetus for this webinar was I went to a conference, and I think on 5 different occasions, people said that they felt the most power dynamic, even just about gear, is going into a situation where everybody feels really comfortable, has all their own stuff, they're weathered down Carhartts or, you know, whatever. And it seems so small, but it's really not. And also some advisors, probably not maliciously, but not thinking about that people are paying for this out of pocket, or that they don't know that they can write this into their NSF grants. So I think that that's relatively low hanging fruit that can make a really big difference.
And can I say one other thing on this topic too? I also have noticed a different of sometimes the gear list that's provided is very specific to men and doesn't consider like women in the field, and that there is definitely some things that I know I also had a wish that I had have known and had with me that wasn't mentioned. So if you're a woman going into the field, again, ask those questions like, where am I going to be going to the bathroom? What does that look like? Is there anything that I should take with me that would be helpful? And those are questions when I first went into the field, I didn't have the confidence to ask. And now I'm like, no, I want to know that before I go. What does that look like? And it's okay to ask those questions. And so it's one of the.
All right, so let's move on to the next question. How do you ensure you and your team are respectfully engaging with everyone in the on-site research environment? So that could be ship technicians, that could be military personnel, base personnel, and then of course indigenous communities.
I think one thing to have is a plan going into it for sure. Like a lot of these discussions we're saying it's easier to navigate complex issues if you go into it with a plan, and then you can change that later on, but have an idea going into it. And a lot of times it's helpful to have a point of contact within your team that's the person leading an interaction with whatever group. So all the communication is kind of there's not mixed messages going to that group. I think that's one thing the teams I've been a part in the past have done that's been helpful. So they establish this is the leader of the point of contact for interacting, I don't know, with the communications department at McMurdo or something like that.
I think like another overall thing, which is probably kind of obvious, but just be kind. Like it's not very hard to be kind, show interest in other people, be curious, ask questions, be perceptive, like listen more than you talk when you're, I think, engaging with Indigenous communities. In my experience, like they had so much to say and so much to share, and it sounded like these people really wanted to engage in these conversations. So that was great. But I think, yeah, just listen a lot. And if you're unsure about anything, I think you just ask instead of assuming what someone else is thinking, or if there's conflict, talk it out. Communication, I think, is the answer to a lot of these questions. It's just like, yeah, effective communication.
Yeah, I also think maintaining really good communication within your team. I mean, I think, as Andy said, like having a plan for going in for how these interactions might be for the different kinds of groups that you might be interacting with. But I mean, as for like a lot of things, having daily group meetings, kind of checking in about and debriefing on things is really helpful. And part of that can also be the groups that you're interacting with. And if there's things that come up that are not what you expected in those interactions, just like debriefing on that and kind of making a good plan so that you have a united front as a team going forward on how to approach those interactions and kind of to deal with anything that might not have gone as you wanted it to is really helpful. So just, yeah, especially maintaining that communication and openness within the team can be helpful throughout that.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. Sorry, Aurora. I just wanted to echo really quickly after the last two speakers. It's so important to learn from these people, whether it be a technician, someone who's worked at McMurdo for 12 years, like they know how that place works, right? Or natives who, like the first time I went to Patufic, used to be Tule, and it was during the 2 weeks where all the natives can come and stay on base, and they wanted to tell me everything. Right? They were talking about how the system has changed in the last 20 or 30 years. I was on the sea ice and they were catching seals, and they're saying this is where we always catch them, this is where we don't. So like that's teaching you oceanography right there. Right? So I think it's so important to be humble first and foremost when you walk into the situation. So sorry, Aurora, I didn't mean to steal your thunder, but
No, I was basically going to say the same thing, like humility and listening. I think there's like a fundamental narrative shift that we can have as researchers where, I think a lot of times we can fall into the trap of thinking, we're going into these like really, remote, wild spaces, in the Arctic, specifically, I guess is what I'm talking about. But this is people's backyards. Like, even if you don't run into that many people, like this is still people's backyards. It's their home. And when you view your work in that way, that you are going to somebody's home and you're going to their backyard, that really changes what your sense of responsibility is, right? Like, if you view it that way, then you're like, okay, I should put a Facebook post on this community, Facebook website to say, hey, like, we're researchers, we're going to be on this boat for a while, we're going to be in these 2 fjords, like you might see us if you're out fishing or out seal hunting. And that's really different if you're viewing it as like, I'm going to where like, these like unexplored remote places. So I always try to mention that. And then the other thing, this question brought up for me too, is that code of conducts often just cover our science team, right? So like when we did our code of conduct last year for our fieldwork, that was not with the crew of the ship that we were working with. And we work really closely with them. Like I work just as closely with the crew members as I do with the other science team members. And so just echoing what the other speaker said, that having communication within our science team, where we asserted that like we wanted positive working relationships with the crew, like then allowed us to sort of like bring those positive conversations and communication we were having within our science team, that like goes out into the concentric circle of like working with the crew. And then that also goes out into like working with the communities. So these aren't like separate issues of whether you have good communication in your science team and good communication with the crew or with communities, like they all build on each other, if that makes sense. I'll stop there.
Yeah, maybe we'll just move on because there's some more good questions coming. So the next one surrounding DEI. So I guess how do I frame this exactly? What are maybe some good things to know about beforehand, or some good resources for people going into the field regarding sort of DEI, and how this has evolved to be a very open and positive conversation versus when I started doing field work, we never even talked about it, right? So I'm excited to hear from any of you also regarding this topic. It's sort of open-ended. I think maybe perhaps we should, yeah, anyone who has like just something to say regarding DEI, I guess now is a good time to expand upon it, and provide us with some insight maybe.
Actually, I have a question. What do you mean DEI?
Sorry, you should always define your acronyms, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, as sort of a standard for people going into sort of remote places together.
I feel like I've been talking a lot, but I can I think can speak to some of the work that we do with Inspiring Girls Expeditions. And there's also Megan and Stephanie are on here too, who work with Inspiring Girls Expeditions as well. But yeah, field science, in glaciology and physical oceanography is like largely still really white, and there's all of these like compounding barriers. And I think like it's just, yeah, I think all of these tools that we're like talking about today and all the things that we mentioned help break down some of those barriers and create like a space where people can ask questions, they can feel comfortable. But there's a lot of things that I think a bystander intervention training course, we often think of that as like for like sexual harassment issues, but it can actually bring up little like microaggression things and how to deal with microaggressions in the field that contribute to a more safe space for everybody. And so one of the things that I recently learned was I think we have this tendency to be like, wow, like you're doing so great for your first time in the field, or like really calling out somebody for like how are you feeling about like this being the first time that you're in the field. And that can be like, that can actually end up to be sort of like a microaggression if that's sort of constantly being called out. And so I just think having awareness, creating a space where people can discuss really openly, and somebody could say like, actually really don't like that you keep like reminding me this is my first time. And I've done that before. Like I've said those words to somebody before. And so there's so many different levels, but I think it comes back to like, if we can create a field culture that people feel comfortable sharing and giving feedback, and we can all learn, then I think that's, yeah, positive. That was a lot of rambly thoughts, but.
Go for it, Olga.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Aurora, I have a question. So you mentioned a training that you had, right? Before. What is the name of the training? Could you please repeat it?
Oh, yeah, it's bystander intervention training. And the USGS does, it's called Step Up. The USGS has a really good model for it that's by scientists for scientists. So it's the trainers are field scientists themselves. And I think that creates the sort of dynamic where other field scientists, where maybe this is new, they are more open to it being trained by other people that know, the weird situations that can come up in the field. But that really opened up a lot of conversations in a way to have that training before going into the field together. And yeah, it's primarily around sexual harassment training and how to sort of stop that as bystanders, but it got into a lot of things about microaggressions as well.
Yeah, okay, we can move forward. I'm just gonna ask one more scripted question, and then with our last remaining 8 to 10 minutes, we can just sort of have free form conversation as we feel led. So the last question is, do you have any tips or recommendations for how an early career scientist can step into a leadership role during on-site research, especially if this is sort of a new field for them, or sort of their first time going out with a team, so on and so forth?
I'd say in my experience, a lot of times there's a huge randomness to whether you're a leader in different projects, just because the availability of people in the projects that come up. But to give yourself an opportunity to lead, I think asking your advisor or the lead of the project, if there's a specific role you can play as a leader, even if you can't lead the whole field season, have it like really clear, like I'm the leader of this specific project. It can be really useful, or this subset, like to put on your resume and going forward, and ask for like very clearly defined roles and responsibilities. And that way you can say, oh, maybe I didn't lead the whole project, but I led this one critical element. And so I think that having that conversation, just asking like, is there a specific thing that I can claim ownership of, and I can say I can contribute it through.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think getting to know your team before you head out and kind of getting a feel for what everyone's expertise, everyone's contributions will be, and kind of where you can fit in that. And if, there's this specific instrumentation that you have experience with, I think just bringing that up and be like, hey, maybe I can't lead for the first time, but I can co-lead, or I'm interested in, leading this part of the project. So I think just having this awareness of what everyone is kind of tasked to do and where you fit in that.
I think along those lines, like having an idea of the instrumentation before you go, even if you've never personally worked with it, is huge, because oftentimes, like, there's just not enough people who are experienced to do everything. So eventually someone will say, hey, can you figure out this one thing? So if you at least have an understanding going into it of the sort of instrumentation that you're going to be working with, then you can sort of have that baseline knowledge. So yeah. Does anyone else have input on that, or anything else to sort of feel inspired to speak to us about?
I'd say one thing, like if you're in the field and you're doing really well, or you're struggling with something, you want to be able to, sometimes it's hard, but just explicitly discuss it with your team or your advisor, and also create a time and place for other people to do it. I think it's really helpful to say, like, now we're going to talk about for the next 15 minutes if anyone has an issue, because sometimes it's hard for you to bring it up yourself. But if you create that space, then other people, for yourself and for other people, then it can allow them to bring something up that they might have been hesitant to otherwise. So having those like stop and check review times built in, I think, is really valuable.
Go for it, Katie.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I mean, following on this, I don't like want to bring down the tone, but I think it's just really important to get into it. So what would your advice be if there's just someone really difficult on the team, or you have a really big interpersonal issue? Do you have advice for how you would deal with it in real time? And then also, if there's any advice, like how you would deal with it back in your home institution or area, to try and make sure this doesn't happen again. I mean, especially being early career, you feel, maybe trapped in a corner. So if there's any advice there that we could pass on.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I never deal with problems that come up in the way that I, wish that I did, in that, like, right, we take these trainings and, you're like, yeah, I'm going to be like the best bystander. And it rarely ever works like that, because there's so much, there's stress, you're tired, there's so many things that you're navigating in the moment. And so I've had a situation where I've been on a ship with somebody that was like having some uncomfortable behavior, not just with me, but with others. And I think just talking to somebody, like if you have a trusted person that you can talk to, and I think that helps as like a gut check. A lot of what happens in my brain is like, I'm probably making a bigger deal out of this than it should be. Or like, I just want to be like a good coworker. I want to keep the peace. Like, I don't want to like raise any issue. And just talking about it with somebody that you trust and knowing who that person is, it can help you identify like next steps. And it can be really helpful to have somebody say, yeah, that's not okay, or like that's crossing a boundary. So don't keep it in your own head. That is my first step. And then sometimes, maybe the calculus of the time is that I feel sad saying this, but like maybe you don't address it in the moment. Like maybe that's too hard given the dynamics. I have a lot of shame about that when that's happened, because I want to be somebody that like has these upfront conversations, but that's okay if you make that choice. But I will say always, like, if you can talk about it afterwards to the person with power, to the PI, to the chief scientist, and that matters. And so I think if you can address it in the moment, do. If you can pull in somebody else to help you do that, that's great, like a facilitator or the PI. And if you can tell the PI and the person with power, do that. But I guess I just want to say, like, don't have shame if you're not the perfect bystander, and that it's never too late. Like, there's never been too much time post cruise or post field work that you can talk about it and mention it to somebody. So yeah, I don't know if that reflects other people's experience. It's messier than we want it to be, but
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. I mean, I think, yeah, as someone who's serially overthinks things, I think often addressing things and being that sort of like reactive bystander that you want to be can be really hard, especially in these field situations where you're going to have to keep working with someone and it's like they're not going to leave. Like, it's going to, you have to continue to have these interactions. I guess just to echo what Aurora said, that I think a lot of times the biggest thing can be like finding support and having a group around you that can like kind of help navigate the situations if there's someone who's particularly difficult, because you often will continue to be in those situations with that person if you're in a remote field situation. So
I'll echo what they're saying, that things can be really challenging and difficult to deal with. I think if you have that code of conduct, it can be really helpful, because you're not saying like, I don't think what you're doing is okay. You're like saying, we agreed upon these rules and these actions are against these rules. So it kind of depersonalizes it. So it makes it a little easier to confront them. And it's like more explicit, because it's like, we set these rules up ahead of time. So if you can point it back to a code of conduct or a set of rules you had going into it, I think that can be really helpful.
One of the things I always like to mention too is code of conducts are even stronger when you have a facilitated debrief discussion afterwards, after the field season. And we so often miss that component. And so I really think of it as like two parts. It's not just the code of conduct beforehand, it's also emphasizing the debrief and the space for discussion afterwards. And that can even happen like, you know, a month after the field season and people have had time to process, and maybe people on the team feel more able to share that like something happened and you can talk about it.
And one more thing on that, if you are, you know, going through working with a science project manager, we strongly advocate that you have a risk assessment call before you go into the field. And we usually work closely with the PI to set that up, but usually we try and get as many team members, research members on that call as well. And you can always write to your project manager and ask for some topics to get added to that risk assessment. It's not just a structured list. And having some hard topics for us as the mediator to bring up before you go into the field too, just as a starting point of what if scenarios, what if this, and of course you're not going to hit everyone, but it's just a platform to start off from, and someone else helping initiate that conversation for your team as well, if it's not an easy conversation going into it. So another recommendation.
I guess in the next 2 minutes or so, if anyone who's attending has any specific questions, feel free to either put it in the chat or say it out loud here.
While we're waiting to see if any questions come in, I just want to say thank you so much again. And also thank you for the resources that were shared in the chat. Like I didn't even think of like Prosecco as having like individual grants for gear. Field Safe sounds like a really great program. So I really appreciate the resources and the information that was shared. I think it's so important for everybody to feel as confident as they can going into the field.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm planning field work next spring, and I'm going to use some of these resources. Thank you all.
Yeah, and already just after this discussion and like seeing all these resources that I can go to, I already feel more comfortable for the next time I go up in the field. So thank you for organizing this. Like this is super important and really helpful.
Also just want to throw out, if people feel that this is a helpful dialogue, we'd love to keep continuing to have webinars with different focuses, whether it's working specifically with Indigenous communities or in different areas, in polar regions. So please feel free to reach out with any future ideas.
And Katie, if I may, I know we're at time right now, but just for everyone on the phone and anyone who might be watching this recording, just wanted to put in a plug that we're in the process of updating our biennial implementation plan within IARPC at the moment. So this outlines team and community of practice like early career, their objectives for the next couple of years. So I just wanted to drop a link to the chat with a Google form that has more information on the plan as well as submitting feedback, and then just wanted to very quickly pull up a slide so it's on the recording as well that has a QR code. Let me get into slideshow view to getting to that Google form as well. So we're just looking for feedback from the community on what objectives and deliverables that we should be continuing over the next couple of years, maybe with some adjustments, any that should be closed out, anything new that should be added. So just really looking to the community for any thoughts, any feedback on, where we're going in terms of Arctic research, what our priorities should be, and just really do want to emphasize that all thoughts, all feedback is considered by the drafting team. It doesn't need to be a big shift, but if it's even just, how these deliverables are structured, any little thought matters. We want to hear from everybody, particularly those kind of in that early career phase, because you will be, stepping into a lot of these Arctic research priorities and projects in the future. So again, there's a link in the chat, QR code on the screen here for accessing that Google form. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out to anybody on the IARPIC team. But thank you for letting me take another extra couple minutes at the back end here.
Awesome. Well, with that, I think we'll close out. So thank you again. If anybody ever has any questions or needs to get in touch with the panelists, you'll be able to find my email on the IARPIC site. Feel free to message me. But thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.